A completely black or blank frame with no visible content.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Core of Discovery 2 in the Tent of Many Voices. This tent has been set up for us as an opportunity to learn from different individuals with different backgrounds, different areas of expertise, hear different sides of the Lewis and Clark story, and also to learn more about the people that Lewis and Clark met as they were heading westward. We are very fortunate to have with us today Amy Mossett, who is Mandan and Hidatsa, from the 3 affiliated tribes of North Dakota, and today she will be giving a presentation on traditional gardening. So if you would please help me welcome Amy Mossett.
Thank you. Thank you. It's nice to be here.
A person in a light blue sleeveless shirt sits at a table with a water bottle and small clock visible behind them. Text on the right reads Department S4 and Partman. The setting appears to be an indoor presentation space.
Here, thanks for coming out. It's the weather is kind of intimidating out there, but it's nice once you get under this tent here. It's cool. It's a lot cooler here than it is being out in a garden today. Even if you went out early this morning, it would already be quite warm out there. 200 years ago, Lewis and Clark, they traveled across Montana, but before they crossed Montana, they spent a winter with us. And they spent a winter with the Mandan and the Hidatsa from October of 1804 through April 7th of 1805 when they left our villages. And Lewis and Clark were not the first non-Indian people to come into our villages. And this is actually one of the villages that Lewis and Clark would have come into 200 years ago. This is the village of Awadikha. And you see the earth lodges that are standing here in this Hidatsa village. This is in North Dakota, north of Bismarck, North Dakota. I don't know how many of you have ever been to Stanton, North Dakota. It's about 6 or 7 miles up the river from where the Knife River would meet the Missouri River, which is about the spot where Lewis and Clark built Fort Mandan, their winter quarters. And the Mandan were living down at the confluence of the Knife and the Missouri, but up the river about 7 miles were 3 Hidatsa villages. And they looked something like this from a distance. There were close to 60 earth lodges, maybe over 60 earth lodges at Awadikha. And the reason I put this slide up on the screen is this is the village that I'm descended from. I can trace my Hidatsa ancestry all the way back to Awadikha. And it's also the village that Sagagawea lived in for about 4 years before she joined the Lewis and Clark expedition. And when she was taken captive, she ended up in this village and then eventually was married to her French-Canadian husband, Toussaint Charbonneau. Well, of course, Sagagawea and any other non-agricultural person who came into our villages would discover that we were a little different than most of the Indians on the northern plains in that we farmed. And the farming that we did was so extensive that it drew people from great distances, because you know that living on the northern plains is pretty tough in weather that's as extreme as it is. And in the wintertime, if there were no buffalo herds nearby, if the buffalo calling ceremonies that we usually had in December didn't bring the buffalo into the villages, or if we had a drought season, if we were not able to do the kind of hunting that we would need to do to dry enough meat to store throughout the winter, life would be pretty tough. But with the Mandan and the Hidatsa villages in North Dakota, and then also with the Arikara further on down in what is now South Dakota.
A person wearing a light blue sleeveless shirt and beaded necklace stands in an indoor setting with wooden paneling, a clock on the shelf behind them, and decorative items including a feathered object nearby.
We had food. We had an abundance of food. Enough food that in the years that we had a surplus, we were able to trade this food. And that's what brought people from great distances. First, other tribal groups, even our enemies, would make peace with us at the end of the growing season, late in the summer. The Sioux in particular, the Arikara were actually our enemies 200 years ago. And it took a very long time for us to ever befriend the Arikara. Eventually, when you look about the village and you're living in the Mandan or a Hidatsa village, and you look around and you see that you're related to everybody in that village, either by clan by marriage or by an extended kinship system or through adoption, and you realize you can't marry anybody in your village anymore, so you have to go down and perhaps, marry somebody from the Mandan village. Or as things got worse, we ended up having to marry into the Arikara tribe. And I shouldn't say that. I shouldn't make jokes about the Arikara, because my daughters are Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara. So, but anyway, we were agricultural people, and the women did the gardening. I think that's the thing that the men are most impressed about, is that the women did the gardening in our villages. And people ask, well, what did you grow in your gardens? And I'm just going to run through all the different kinds of crops that we grew.
A person wearing a light blue sleeveless top and a lanyard sits at a table with a white baseball cap visible. Behind them is a black backdrop with partial text reading department. US 4 and PAR, suggesting an official setting.
In our Hidatsa and Mandan villages, the gardens were not located right within the villages. The gardens would be located outside the villages, not on the prairie, but on the river bottom. And the Mandan have lived on the Missouri River for thousands of years. And even 1,000 years ago, my Mandan ancestors were farming down in the southern part of South Dakota, near the South Dakota-Nebraska border. And archaeological evidence indicates that we farmed to a great extent at the borders of South Dakota and Nebraska 1,000 years ago. And so it's a centuries-old tradition that we pass on from generation to generation, from mother to daughter, and it just continues into every single generation, and we're still doing that today. The women did the gardening, and the Mandan, according to what we've learned about our history, is the Mandan had 13 different varieties of corn, just corn alone. And of course, you know that you have to keep corn separated. You cannot plant it close to another plot of another variety of corn. And so we also had, accordingly, 13 different clans within the Hidatsa tribe. A lot of times people...
A person in a light blue sleeveless shirt with beaded collar stands at a podium holding a white object. Behind them is a dark banner with partial text visible. The setting appears to be indoors.
People are confused between clans and tribes and bands and societies and so on, but all tribes are very different. And then within tribes, you have different bands of people, you have different clans within the tribes. And the Mandan had about 13 different clans. The Hidatsa also had about 13 different clans. And those clans really define who you are, what you do, the kind of corn that you plant every year, who you can tease, who you can marry. It sets the rules, and it sort of sets the stage for your whole life and how you live. And the way you live is always determined by your mother's clan. And so that's where you receive your identity and receive really identity.
A person wearing a light blue sleeveless shirt with a beaded collar stands with hands raised, speaking. Behind them is a dark banner with partial text reading US DEP and DEPA. A clock is visible on a shelf in the background.
Identify who you are and what clan and what tribe you belong to is through your mother. Through your father's clan, that is the clan you go back to the spirit world through when you die. And so your father's clan is also very important, because the afterlife is forever, whereas this life is just temporary. But we had 13 different varieties of corn, and today we still grow quite a few of those varieties. We had flour corn, which is a softer corn that you can grind, and then we had sweet corn, and then we also had a flint corn, which is really a very hard corn. This is blue flour corn, and all of this is corn that my daughters and my granddaughters and I have been growing over the years. But we have blue flour corn, yellow flour corn, red flour corn, Mandan sweet corn, and then I have some gummy corn around here someplace, but it's probably down here in my burden basket, my Tupperware box. In addition to all the different varieties of corn that we planted, we also planted beans, squash, sunflowers, and when we were able to, we planted melons. Watermelons are really crops or seeds that we acquired from the Arikara. So there were some positive things about the Arikara in that they were able to grow watermelon further down south when they were in South Dakota. You can still grow melons in North Dakota if you have a real long growing season. But just to give you an example, Last year in June we had a frost, and I think it was about June 18th. The temperature in Dickinson, North Dakota was 25 degrees. And so we lost a lot of June berries and some of the other berries. We didn't have any plums, but we also had a very cold August. And in order to grow these crops, you need to have long, hot days. And you know that on the northern plains, we have light for a very long time. It doesn't get dark until about 10:30, but we also have really extreme heat, very long days, a lot of light. And so because of that, we are able to grow, or we have been able to grow crops in a relatively short growing season. The way we grow our crops, this is a Mandan village here. You can actually visit this replicated Mandan village. This is on a slant Mandan village on the west side of the Missouri River, just south of Mandan, North Dakota. And my Mandan ancestry goes back to the west side, to the Nuata Mandan villages. This is my garden that's growing right now west of Newtown, North Dakota. And you can see how it's growing in nice, neat rows. Well, 200 years ago, or even 500 years ago, the gardens weren't planted in nice, neat, tilled rows. The gardens were planted as soon as spring arrived. And we know that all winter long,
a person wearing a light blue sleeveless top and beaded necklace sits indoors. Behind them are wooden shelving units, a small clock, and other office items. The setting appears to be an interior room or office space.
Women who would be going out there to garden were probably they probably held very prominent positions in one of the women's societies. And we had, I mentioned clans and then bands and societies. Within tribes, there are societies that are specific to different activities, and societies they're very similar to societies that we have today. They really regulate a lot of the social and the ceremonial and political organization of the tribe. And one of the most important societies that we had was the Goose Woman Society, and it was a garden society. And the Goose Woman Society was comprised of women who were in their childbearing years. And of course that makes sense, because women in their childbearing years are fruitful and they're productive, and they are the women who are charged with this task of going out and harvesting and planting and nurturing this crop, these acres and acres of crops all summer long, singing the ceremonial songs, engaging in the kinds of prayers and the ceremonies that are associated with traditional gardening. Now, not everybody belonged to the Goose Woman Society. You had to purchase your way into that society, and I think it makes sense that the women who belonged to the Goose Woman Society or to any of the women's society were daughters of very prominent families, and prominent families were those families that possessed and were the keepers of very important medicine bundles. And there are medicine bundles, of course, that are associated with gardens. And so the Goose Women Society would engage in all of these activities throughout the years. Now there are, and I'm sure that women are, of course, curious about what happens when you're beyond your childbearing years. Then what society do you belong to then? Well, the women who were beyond their childbearing years moved into, or sort of graduated into probably the most important women's society, and that was the White Buffalo Cow Society for the women who were beyond their childbearing years. And that was a society comprised of the wisest women, the teachers, the keepers of the tradition, the women who taught and who advised all of the younger women of the village. And so the older you were, the more important you became in our culture. Now, with our gardens, you see that it probably looks like there's weeds growing in that garden, because there is all this stuff around the bottom of the corn stalk. Those are beans. And corn was planted, the very first thing we planted in the beginning of the year, of course, was sunflowers, and I'll show you some images of my sunflower plants. But this is the way we planted this corn.
A person wearing a light blue sleeveless shirt and a beaded necklace sits indoors, looking toward the left. Behind them is a wooden shelf with a clock and other items, and what appears to be a feathered object on a chair.
Not in rows, but in hills. And this corn is not actually planted in hills like it was long ago, hundreds of years ago, though in the beginning of the spring, or let's say in the fall. The men would help with the women. They would go down into the river bottoms, and they would chop down some of the trees, and they would let them fall onto the ground. And the pieces of that tree that could be used for firewood or that could be cut for firewood would be taken back to the village. But the rest of the tree was left laying there on the ground to dry out. And by spring, they would come back and they would pull all of the organic matter, all of the grass and the weeds and the stubble out of the ground, and then they would leave it laying on the ground, and then they would burn it all. And of course, those of you who are farming the land know that when you burn any organic matter and it is absorbed into the ground, it softens the ground and it nourishes the ground. And so that was the whole purpose of not dragging this organic matter off the garden site. And then the sunflowers were planted the very earliest. They were as soon as the water on the Missouri River started to break up and thaw, and the geese were flying back from the south. Those were the signs. Those were the signs out in the environment that it was time to put in the sunflowers, and those sunflowers would then be planted, the very first crop. They were the last crop to be harvested late in the fall. Now the corn would be planted in late May or early June. And sometimes, again, if a frost came in early in June or late in May after the corn had come up, we would just go back out and plant more seed. Which, of course, is why it was so important that when we gathered seed at the end of the year and saved it, you always saved enough seed every single year for several more plantings. Because the following year, if the insects or a drought or a hailstorm came in and wiped out your whole harvest, you couldn't be sitting there without seed. So you'd have to have enough seed for at least a couple more years of planting. Now, why is this corn planted with the beans around it? Well, the women of the villages knew that there was this symbiotic relationship between corn and beans. And when you plant corn and beans together, you kind of have a mess. Oh, that's a sunflower. When you plant corn and beans together, well, let's just go back and talk about the sunflowers for a second since I have them on here. This is our sunflower. Notice it doesn't have that one single tall, long stalk. Our sunflowers grew with multiple flowering heads. And in one of my sunflowers from last year, I counted 41 flowers or 41 heads on the sunflower. But
A person wearing a light blue sleeveless shirt and a beaded necklace sits indoors, looking off to the side. Behind them are wooden shelves holding a clock and other items, with dark walls and equipment visible in the background.
only the top ones were about 6 inches across. And of course, the very largest, the very first sunflower that grew and got the largest, that was my seed for the next year. But the largest head, it could have been up to 11 inches across, but for the most part, they weren't much bigger than 8 inches across. And the very top one would be this big, and then as you go down the whole plant, they get smaller and smaller. But with one of the sunflowers that I planted last year, I had 41 flowering seeds on there, or seed heads. With the sunflowers, they're real sticky, and these sunflower plants get very tall. And what you do with sunflowers is you plant them around the edge of the garden, and I planted all of mine on the north side of the garden so that they wouldn't really shade any more of my garden. But the other thing that these sunflowers do, because they're real sticky and they have real rough stems, they help to keep your corn from cross-pollinating. And when these sunflowers get to be about 13 feet high, they make a very good barrier in between gardens. They also help to keep your gardens separate, so you never have to get into an argument with your sister-in-law about whose garden you're working in, because you have this long row of sunflowers that sort of borders your garden and separates you from your sister-in-law. And you might have lots of sister-in-laws depending on how many brothers you have. And you just don't want to get into any hassles with your sister-in-law. Okay, this is just a little bit closer image. You can see all the way down the stem how the sunflower is flowering. And of course, this is the the flower at the top of the sunflower, and it's not very big, but you see all the leaves and the foliage and everything is quite extensive on the sunflower. This is I just put a pen in here so you can kind of get an idea of the size of my sunflower. And then, of course, that is, I sprouted the plants, and long ago, the women would just take a piece of hide and dampen it and put the sunflowers in the hide and let them sprout and soften up the seed before they put them into the ground. I let mine sprout quite a lot before I put them in the ground, not because they need it to sprout a lot, but because I really travel a lot and I'm not home as much as I should be. These are the beans. These are auricera beans. Oh, here I am growing auricera beans. I can't believe it. But I was working with an elder relative of mine, and she, for the longest time, just insisted that these are not auricera beans. These are Mandan beans. But you know, I think a lot of times, depending on who these seeds were collected from, there would always be an interpretation of whether they were Mandan or.
A person wearing a light blue sleeveless shirt and a beaded necklace sits in front of a wooden desk with a clock and shelving. They are indoors, looking toward the camera with a serious expression.
Hidatsa or auricera. But you know, I would say that since I've been planting these things for quite a few years, by now they got to be Mandan beans, so, or Hidatsa beans at least. But this is what the bean plant looks like. And this is what the bean plant looks like when it's growing up. And remember, I said there was this symbiotic relationship between corn and beans. As the plant grows, these beans really need something to cling to. Yeah, maybe they are auricera. They just twine around that corn, and they're just stuck there. You're stuck with that bean plant all the way through harvest. But these plants need each other. You know, this is Mandan blue flower corn growing, and the beans that are growing on this plant actually are shield beans. And these shield beans, these are my favorite beans. They're so pretty, and they're white. They're white, and they're big, white, plump beans, and they have kind of a red shield on them, and they're called shield beans. But you can come up and take a look at this stuff when my program is through here. And corn and beans, there's this symbiotic relationship, because you know that corn does not have a very extensive root system, and beans do. This is corn before I healed it, and you can see that if a strong wind came along, it would just knock this corn right over. But when you have a bean plant growing at the base of that corn, and the bean plant has a real extensive root system, and it also, because it's a legume, it nourishes the soil. And so the root of the bean nourishes the root of the corn and helps it to grow better. The corn stalk provides a climbing device for the bean to grow on, because if you let one of these beans grow by itself, and I did this last year, and you have these long stringers and runners just looking for something to cling onto, and you just almost feel sorry for that poor little bean plant, because it's just out there looking for something to climb on. And so the corn stalk provides that climbing device for the bean. And then the corn also provides shade for the bean plant, and corn that grows in shade grows better than, beans that grow in shade grow a lot better and produce more quickly than beans that are growing right directly in the sun. And so, you know, the women, and I think this is amazing that the women knew that there was this relationship between these plants, and that's the way they planted them. The only downside to all of this is that when you go to harvest this in the fall, it is just an absolute mess. That's why it's a good thing to have many daughters and many granddaughters. This is one of my favorite plants. This is red flower corn, Mandan red flower corn, and this is what's growing out in my traditional garden west of Newtown. And again, we would put the corn in late May.
A person wearing a light blue sleeveless shirt and a beaded necklace sits indoors, facing slightly to the side. Behind them is wooden furniture, a clock, and what appears to be an institutional or educational setting.
Very late May and early June. And again, if we had a frost all the way into the middle of June, we still might be able to put some corn in and hope that we didn't have an early frost. At the base of these beans, I think we have auricera beans growing. And you can see the stalks on that corn. The stalk on the corn is actually red. Also, it's not all green. This is a close-up of my red flower corn. I love red flower corn because it's just so red, the whole stalk. And when you pull the husk, or when you pull the corn off the stalk in the fall, the outside of the husk is all red, and you can make all kinds of beautiful things with that red corn husk. This is the top of the tassel, or the top of the corn, and that too is red. It's very pretty. Or burgundy, I guess. It's a very pretty color. This is a Arikara sunflower, or an Arikara melon, all by itself, out there in the garden. We only planted 3 of them, and it was just so difficult for us to get these Arikara seeds sprouted. And my Arikara seeds would sprout, and this year I even put them in little pots, and they came out of the pot, and I was so pleased, and I was crossing my fingers. And then I left for a few days and came home, and those Arikara plants were just laying there, just dead. And I couldn't figure out what happened to them. And my daughter, Nicole, looked at me and she said, "Well, Mom, you know, you really are not Arikara." And I said, "Yeah, I know, and I don't think it's because I'm not Arikara that my Arikara melons absolutely refuse to grow. I think it's just because of all those terrible Arikara jokes I'm telling constantly." The squash was planted at the very end of the garden because these plants take up so much space. And the leaves just grow all over. And with the squash plants, I'll talk about it now. We dried everything. When we harvested our crops, everything was dried. There was no refrigeration, no ice, no canning. Everything was dried. The beans were dried. With the beans, we didn't pull them off individually. You could just go into the garden and sort of thrash the beans, and they'll just pop right out of these pods. The squashes, and I have a few pictures of some squash flowers. Or you can hardly see these. These are my squash seeds that I sprouted and then put into the garden. And then here we have squash growing, and up in the corner there you can see that little green and white ball, and that was the first of one of my squashes that I grew last year. And then of course the squash blossom plants. Now, not only did we eat the squash, we also ate the flowers. And we have recipes for all of this stuff. And with squashes, we would eat them fresh as soon as we harvested them, but also we would dry them, and we would cut the squashes.
A person wearing a light blue sleeveless shirt and a beaded necklace sits indoors. Behind them is wooden furniture, a small clock on a shelf, and dark walls with wooden framing.
In slices, about almost an inch thick. And imagine how difficult this would be for the women, because we had different kinds of squash. Some of that squash had real soft, the outer part of the squash is real soft, and some of it is really hard, and as you're cutting it, it just sort of cracks while you're cutting it. And imagine trying to cut that stuff with a flint knife. You know, we didn't have knives until the Europeans came into the villages and introduced metal. And the men just loved metal, but the women, used, we eventually began to use metal knives and metal awls and metal hoes and those kinds of things. But before we had metal, all of our tools were made out of everything that we could take from our environment. Our hoes for the garden were made from a black-tailed deer's antlers. And then, of course, you'd put a ash wood digging stick or an ash wood handle on this, because ash wood is very hard, and you could and it's very durable. It would last for a long time, and that ash wood would get real smooth, but it would also be very sturdy. We also use the shoulder blade of a buffalo, and of course this is not a shoulder blade from a buffalo, but this is a little shoulder blade, and we would attach an ash stick here and use rawhide or sinew to wrap it real tight, and then you'd have just a perfect hoe, to go and work in the garden. We had to do something before Martha Stewart had her TV series, and so we had many things that we were able to use. In addition to our blacktail antler rakes, we also had willow rakes. and we would make rakes out of willow, and so we had tools. Our digging sticks, we did not have hoes, we did not have tillers. We had digging sticks, and the digging sticks were also made from ash wood, and we really sharpened the end of it and then burned the end, and then that digging stick was perfect. It lasted throughout the summer. With the digging sticks, you know, again, I said we didn't till these long rows. You went out and you dug a hole, you dug one mound, and you would plant in hills. And you would plant your corn and beans in that one hill. You didn't dig anything up in between, but you'd move 4 feet over, and then you'd dig up another hole, chop up the dirt where it was nice and soft, and then you'd put another few kernels of corn and beans in there, and then you'd move down another 4 feet, and then, you know, dig another hill. And so everything was done in hills, and we didn't really mess around with the area in between the hills except to take out the weeds and keep it clean. With my garden that I grew up in Newtown, my rows are 4 feet.
A person wearing a light blue sleeveless shirt and a beaded necklace sits indoors. Behind them is a wooden shelf with a clock, and dark wooden paneling forms the background.
Apart, all of the corn that I planted is about 2 feet apart. And so and the beans are planted in, really not actually in the same hill, but my beans are planted in between the 2 corns. And so as they grow, they're going to attach onto one stalk or the other. And so that's kind of how my garden is growing right now. With the squash flowers, we would take the little green stem off the bottom and flatten them out and dry them so that in the wintertime you could have fresh squash flowers in your soup or in the recipe that we had, or else we would cook them immediately, and they were pretty tasty. Here again is another squash blossom, and the name for this, you know, I'm not really sure. I guess you can call it a squash blossom or a pumpkin flower or a squash flower, but in Hidatsa, the name for that yellow flower is Gakui Nagabagi. That's in your test when we finish this, everyone has to spell that correctly. Gakui Nagabagi. Here's another squash plant. This is my last slide here, and I'll leave it there. With the gardening is a really important part of our, has always been a very important part of our culture, and people often wonder, like, where do Indians get their names? And Indian names, traditional names, I guess you could call them, come from medicine bundles. And so you can imagine in our culture how many medicine bundles were in our Mandan and Hidatsa culture that were associated with gardening. If you come into our villages, you will never find anybody with a name that has anything to do with salmon. We don't have too many names that have anything to do with elk, or we don't have a lot of names that are named after shells, because those are really not things that are in our environment. But we have many names that are associated with gardening. We have many names. We have names with like corn silk and names that are associated with the squashes, and many names that come from gardening. And that's still a very important part of our culture today. This is actually my name, my Hidatsa name. And in Mandan, my relatives would call this Ga'osidahe, and again in Hidatsa, it's Gakui Nagabagish, or Gakui Nagabagi. And so my name, when I was given this name, I was given the traditional name of Gakui Nagabagish. And the reason I say it in Hidatsa is that the clan relative of mine who gave me the name was Hidatsa, and she was.
A person wearing a light blue sleeveless shirt and a beaded necklace sits indoors, looking to the side. Behind them is a wooden shelf with a clock, and dark wooden paneling lines the walls.
A member of the Hidatsa clan. And the Hidatsa clan that I belong to is also the Hidatsa clan that was, this village at the beginning here, the village of Awadikha on the south bank of the Knife River was a village comprised mostly of Mandan or Hidatsa people who belonged to a clan called the Midibade. And just one little interesting note, clans had sort of subdivisions, and There was a subdivision of this Hidatsa clan, the Midibade, and that subdivision was called Itishuka. And I've just learned through my studies that Sagaguia's son belonged to the Itishuka clan. And I find that really interesting because we don't really know for certain which clan Sagaguia belonged to, but we can sort of speculate that perhaps the clan she was adopted into was Itishuka, because when her son was born, he would automatically be a member of that clan. And so with the last thing I really would like to say about traditional gardening, is to talk about why, why do we still do this? We can go to the store and buy a bag of beans or a can of corn, but you can't, and you can go to flea markets or to farmers markets and you can get corn, like colored corn. But I think it's really important for us to keep all of these different varieties of corn pure and to reestablish a seed bank which is specifically seed grown by Mandan, Hidatsa, and women agriculturalists, horticulturalists, gardeners. And it's important because that was really part of our culture. It really defined who we were. And every time I think about traditional gardening, gardening, any kind of gardening, and what it meant to the survival of our villages, it was so significant, it was so important. It's really what brought people into the Knife River Indian Villages trade area, because the women's work produced enough of a surplus of an item that was used for trade. And before the Mandan moved into this part of the country and brought all of their corn culture, the Hidatsa traded flint, Knife River flint. And that was the main item of trade. But once the Mandan came into the northern plains, then the Hidatsa adopted that part of their culture. And really, the two cultures started to meld to the point where today there's really no distinguishing between Mandan and Hidatsa except in name only. But it's also very important because it's part of our culture, and no matter what culture you are, whether it's Norwegian or German or Chinese or Chinook or Nez Perce, it's always really important, I think, for all of us to...
A person wearing a light blue sleeveless shirt and beaded necklace sits indoors, looking toward the left. Behind them is wooden furniture, a clock on a shelf, and a feathered object on the chair back.
Teach our children as much about our culture as we can. The other thing about gardening is that for young people, I think every single community should have a gardening club for children. And the reason for that is that when a young person plants in the earth, if you talk to a lot of young children and ask them, where does celery come from? Or where does a potato come from? A lot of young people do not know where potatoes come from. And so when you take children out and have them plant one plant, a tomato plant, and they see this little white flower growing on that tomato plant, and then all of a sudden there's this little green ball on that plant, and then before you know it, it turns kind of red and it gets bigger and bigger, and then you can take that tomato off that plant, you can eat it, you can make it into all kinds of different things. And this child will all of a sudden have a whole new kind of respect for the earth and for every living thing that comes out of the earth. And I really do think that people who till the soil and people who plant flowers, people who plant trees, people who plant food, and people who use the earth in a real respectful way and teach that to children just have a whole different kind of respect for all living things. And I think that's why it's so important for us to carry on these kinds of traditions, because our children today, all of our children, I say that about my own children, my grandchildren, really need to learn lessons in respect. And I think gardening is one of the ways that we can teach that without, lecturing and pounding all these things. And plus it also helps to sort of, lessen your burden, because if you can take a bunch of kids out into the garden and have them help you to pull weeds around 194 corn plants, it'll really shorten your day. And it's a lot of hard work, but I think it's all really worth it. And I love gardening, and my daughters all garden with me. My daughters all have traditional names that are associated also with food that grows off the earth. My oldest daughter's name is Midhuba Madzu, which in Hidatsa is cedar berries. My second daughter, who is 19 years old, her traditional name is Madzu Dabash, which is June berries, and my youngest daughter, who is 17, is Young Turtle, and her name is Ma Dahi. My granddaughter, who's here with me, also has a traditional Hidatsa name, and her name is Ragudi Sagids. And her name, our names had all belonged to somebody in the past. My oldest daughter has her own very original name, which was given to her, and my granddaughter has her own original.
A person wearing a light blue sleeveless shirt and beaded necklace sits in an indoor setting with wooden furniture and a clock visible in the background. They appear to be during a presentation or interview.
Original name that did not ever belong to anybody else, and her name in Hidatsa again is Arugudi Sagids, and in English her name means good garden. I have time to answer a few questions if you would like to ask me anything you would like. And we have a mic here so everybody can hear the question.
I have two questions. The first one's easy. The second one, if you don't want to share, I'll understand. The first one is, do you use traditional tools in your garden? Or do you use stuff you buy at the hardware store?
I use traditional tools when I do my programs, and I use the most modern conveniences I can when I'm in the garden.
The other one is, if you're free to share, how does your creation story line up with your gardening culture?
We have a few different creation stories, and you know, I think I can even tell you some creation stories here, because you know we have a certain time of the year when we can tell creation stories here in my medicine bag. We have you know, all tribes have creation stories, and you know I can tell you the story because it's right at the beginning of this book. If you wanted to learn more about traditional gardening, this is a Hidatsa. It's a book about life with a Hidatsa woman. It's called Buffalo Bird Woman's Garden. Mahirawish is her name, and at the very beginning she talks about the Hidatsa creation story, and in that creation story it actually, and in the Hidatsa creation, the Hidatsa believed that we lived under the earth. And in eastern North Dakota, near Devil's Lake, or what is now called Devil's Lake, North Dakota, and there was a vine, and the people came upon this vine, and it went up into the sky, and so they climbed the vine, and here they came out, and they came out onto the earth. And there was one woman who was heavy with child. She was expecting, you know, she was very large and expecting her child, and when they sent her up the vine broke. And so the vine was gone, and everybody hadn't come out of the earth yet. And so there's the belief that many of our Hidatsa relatives are still living under the earth near the Devil's Lake. It's not Devil's Lake, it's Spirit Lake in or east central North Dakota. And then with the Mandan creation story, it's a very similar story. There are several variations depending on which side of the river you're on, but according to the Mandan story, it's believed that we came out of the water also, and at the center of the universe. And so there's kind of some difference of opinion on where we actually came out of the earth to the center of the universe, because a lot of people believe that our
A person wearing a light blue sleeveless shirt and beaded necklace sits indoors, looking to the side. Behind them is wooden furniture, a small clock on a shelf, and dark walls with partial text visible.
culture, or that the Mandan agricultural people actually migrated up the Mississippi and Missouri River and may have been somehow connected to the Cahokian mound builders culture.
I'm just wondering how you can obtain some of the corn seeds if you wanted to try some in your own garden.
How do you obtain the corn seeds? There's a place in Ames, Iowa that I think has really taken over a lot of the Oscar Will seeds. Oscar Will was a pioneer in gardening and in seed collecting, especially, particularly the seeds from the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara. And he was in North Dakota for many, many years. And I think that the Ames seed company that seed company in Ames, Iowa, has a lot of the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara seed. There's also on the internet, you can check into seed savers, and you can find corn seed and a lot of different kinds of seed through the internet. The internet, you can find anything on eBay, I hear. But Seed Savers has corn seed. We are packaging our seed, and after this year's harvest, we do hope that we will have enough seed and that the corn will be good enough that we'll be able to package it. And we do have a signature event and the whole Lewis and Clark Bicentennial coming back through North Dakota in 2006. And we do have our signature event in 2006. And so we will be selling our corn seed during that time, and then probably on the internet in the future. Do we have any? Okay, back here.
Do you do any irrigating? How do you keep the water to the plants?
My garden in Newtown, North Dakota is planted right in my yard. So I have, my oldest daughter lives at my house in Newtown. In this garden here, this is actually a land lab. There's a huge land lab west of Newtown, North Dakota. And Fort Berthold Community College is a 4-year college. And at this college, it's the mission of all tribal colleges to strengthen and perpetuate the history and culture of the people of that particular college. And our college has really taken on a huge role in perpetuating and strengthening the whole agricultural culture of our tribe, the traditional agriculture of our tribe. And so we have a huge agricultural division at our tribal college. They go around to different parts of the whole reservation. They actually till plots throughout the reservation. And then this land lab, the whole surrounding area of our garden is tilled weekly.
A person wearing a light blue sleeveless shirt with a beaded necklace sits indoors. Behind them is wooden shelving with a clock and various objects. The setting appears to be an interview or presentation space.
Really clear of weeds, and in between it's tilled, and they actually dug a well, and they have water piped all the way over here. So thank goodness, we don't have to go hauling water with any water vessels or buffalo stomachs or anything like that. We just grab the garden hose, and sometimes they even water it for us if we're on extended travel. So.
Are there any stories or traditions related to the walling about of the different plots by the sunflowers as they create that barrier? Are there stories that go with those walls? I mean, we have paradise gardens, and paradise really means wall in its original. Are there any stories that go with the wall, with separation, with sunflowers?
The only stories I know with the separation of the sunflowers is that you just don't want to get into a hassle with your sister-in-law. No, the walls, it just makes sense. I don't know any stories. There are a lot of stories. There are songs. There are prayers, all associated with gardening. And I didn't mention this, but in 1912 through about 1915, I think there was I'm not sure if she was ethnomusicologist or something like this. Frances Densmore came out to the Northern Plains, and she was commissioned, I think, by the Smithsonian, or it was an Eastern Museum. She was commissioned to come out there and record Teton Sioux warrior songs and different songs on those wax cylinders. And so while she came out to the Northern Plains on the train, the State Historical Society of North Dakota commissioned her to record Mandan and Hidatsa songs. And she recorded Mandan and Hidatsa songs from the men who sang war songs, eagle trapping songs, all of these magnificent songs. And she also recorded my great-great-great-grandmother, Otter Woman, who was singing garden songs. And it was just, it's extraordinary, because a friend of mine in Makoche recording in Bismarck had some of the recordings, and people have sent me some of the recordings in the mail, and you can listen to the recordings. They're on tape. They're on a cassette tape. Now they took them from the wax cylinders and put them onto reels. They put them onto the reels at the wrong speed, Or from the reels to the cassettes, they were done at the wrong speed, and so those songs that people thought were men singing were actually women singing some garden songs. And so in the last couple of years, they've kind of they speeded up or adjusted the speed and
A person wearing a light blue sleeveless shirt and a beaded necklace sits in front of a wooden desk with a clock and office items. They are indoors, looking toward the camera with a serious expression.
We recorded them onto cassettes and CDs, and so we can actually reorder all of these songs now that were sung by our ancestors. But to be able to sit in a sound studio where you have this magnificent sound, and he had all the technology to clean up the pounding and the scratching that was on the original wax cylinders, but to sit there and listen to my great-great-great-grandmother singing garden songs was just the most extraordinary experience of my whole gardening career. And so it's pretty special, and there are lots of stories, and there are sacred stories that are associated with gardening, and there are prayers and songs, and just so much information out there that we're trying to sort of pass on down to the kids when they listen.
Did you raise blue corn? I got some from Gurney one year.
Yes, we did.
Blue potatoes.
Blue potatoes? I have never planted blue potatoes. I was just trying to think if I ever planted potatoes, but I'm not sure. You can't drop that on the corn. You have to pick up all the little shells that fell on the ground now. I've never planted blue potatoes. I rarely planted white potatoes. Most of that stuff that's really not traditional, I don't plant, and it's because it's so much work just to plant all of this and take care of it, and it's tough to do that in between other jobs, and so this to me is just so important to get this stuff planted. And then of course with the Fort Berthold Community College, what we're doing is we are trying to reestablish a seed bank there. There's a lot of seed there on the reservation, but people can't tell you where they got the seed or when it was planted or who planted it. And with a lot of this corn, I can trace this corn all the way back to who planted the original seed. And I think that's very important to do that and to catalog that so you know where all of this is coming from and you know the history of it.
We have time for one last question.
Monsanto Seed Company just created a thing called the Terminator gene. And within 5 days after 9/11, they bought up 56 seed companies, which means that all our seeds are now either hybrid or owned by one company which owns a gene to terminate that seed after one production. So what you're doing is extremely vitally important to our survival. We have to keep the genetic seeds being produced, being held in the... In fact, we went into the Hopi land and into the Navajo land to find pure seed. It rarely exists anymore except held by the native tribes. So my question is, how do you keep it from crossing? How do you keep one line pure of corn from crossing with the other line?
A person wearing a light blue sleeveless shirt and a beaded necklace sits indoors. Behind them is wooden furniture, a clock on a shelf, and dark curtains. They face slightly leftward in what appears to be an interview or presentation setting.
We plant one variety of corn in each of our gardens, and the traditional garden plot out at west of Newtown at the Land Lab is completely separated by a great distance and a huge grove of trees from the other garden. And every year we plant one variety of corn. And I have an older sister and 3 brothers, and they're actually better gardeners than I am, except for my older sister. She's always planting her corn too close together. And I was telling her to, don't plant your corn close together, it's going to cross. And she said, well, yeah, but when it grows, it's so pretty. And I'm telling her, but you're Mandan and Hidatsa, and having pretty corn is not the point. What you're trying to do is maintain the integrity of one variety of seed and corn, and so hopefully she's planting her corn. But we do plant only one variety of corn in one location, which is so far away from any other corn that there's no chance of it crossing. So. Well, thank you so very much for being here this afternoon.
Thank you very much. Once again, Amy Mossett. We appreciate
A person wearing a light blue sleeveless shirt and a beaded necklace sits in front of a wooden desk with a small clock visible on a shelf behind them. The setting appears to be an indoor institutional space. A person wearing a light blue sleeveless shirt and a beaded necklace sits indoors, looking to the side. Behind them is a wooden shelf with a clock and other items, and dark wooden paneling on the walls.